Faculty of Earth Science have been established in 2012. We are in one of the youngest university in Malaysia. We have a vision to become a pioneer in sustainability, environment, and natural resource through entrepreneurship agenda.
Currently, Faculty of Earth Science offering 3 undergraduate programs. We also have 2 preparatory programs which managed at Faculty of Earth Science.
For Bachelor of Applied Science, Natural Resource with Honours, the focus of this program are much more on our biosphere, which means we are focusing on our plants, our animal, and also the management of our tropical forest. For another program, which is Bachelor of Applied Science, Sustainable Science with Honours, the program itself relate more on environmental element, which is we would like to sustain our environment together with the importance of economy and also social.
Always apply teaching and learning section by using technology such as by using GIS, drone, geospatial mapping technology, and also modeling. Students also be taught with to integrate geoscience understanding from classroom or practical learning with geoscience data from a variety of sources, creatively using the latest digital technology.
Science Preparatory Department is a new department and need to taking care and manage of 2 academic programs. Both of these programs will need to learn biology, mathematics, chemistry, and also physics.
Faculty of Earth Science Museum, actually we have various dry and wet specimens such as insects, small mammals, reptiles. Besides that, we also have rocks, minerals, and also fossil. So actually all those specimens being collected by our students.
To stay relevant, you have to be flexible. Besides flexible, we have to be unique. In Faculty of Earth Science, we have multidisciplinary research. Recently, we are focusing on the research on minerals and the fossil. Other than that, we use remote sensing and GIS in monitoring forests and urban planning. This research has been successfully done within our capacity of staff, supported with the grant that we received from government and other agencies.
We are optimistic to become one of the best faculty that focus on in environmental in Malaysia.
We offer excellent opportunities for the students to gain really in-depth knowledge about a particular area of biological sciences. We have a very broad school in terms of the facilities and the staff expertise available to the students.
So we're a school of biological sciences and also environmental sciences. So we cover a real wide range of disciplines within the school. And that translates into a number of different courses for students that are on top programs. So they benefit from the breadth of disciplinary expertise that we have in staff.
So our lab has developed over the last 5-6 years into one of the top research labs in the world for honeybees. We have techniques here that no one else can do. We're at the real cutting edge of genetics, genomics, proteomics. We've got hives in the field that we can use for research, and we have internationally renowned researchers visiting our lab regularly to pick up techniques and to collaborate with us.
I think the University of Aberdeen provide a very large range of facilities, and that contributes to their success and also to their learning journey in terms of scientific experience.
We were ranked first in the United Kingdom in the recent Research Excellence Framework. We were ranked first under agriculture, veterinary and food science, including soil and environmental sciences. And so we have world-class research facilities and, more importantly, research staff.
The bee research here is quite established. There's quite a few PhD students working on bees, and our supervisors have been doing it for a few years now. It's a really good research reputation that Aberdeen and the department's got.
We are a school that really believes in practical skills and technical skills, so we do a lot of practical teaching. So all of our courses involve some practical work that might be in the lab or it might be in the field.
We've got 9 residential field courses, mostly about a week long. They're mostly in Scotland, but we also have 2 in the Mediterranean, 1 in Greece, which is a marine-based field course, and 1 in Spain, which is an ecosystems-based field course.
On the plant ecology course, which I teach, we go out for 3 full days, 2 days into national nature reserves, 1 on the coast and 1 inland beside the Cairngorm National Park.
We've got resident populations of seals, we've got resident populations of dolphins that we can study. But also when you go the other way, we're very close to the Cairngorms and all the beautiful and wonderful forest habitats and mountain habitats we've got there.
In a day's field trip from Aberdeen, we've seen a wild variety of animals, including otters, a range of birds that have migrated here. We've seen eagles, and it's all within a single day. So imagine living here and having that opportunity on your doorstep every day.
So Scotland is actually a wonderful environment in its own sake. So actually coming to Aberdeen is one of these hidden jewels of the UK.
It's very convenient for you as a student to have everything close by, and it makes your life much easier.
So we try and give the students that experience of constructing a piece of work that demonstrates their achievement in the course, but that is relevant to what they would be asked to do in the workplace.
It was the best place to do it. So I didn't see a lot of other places that took soil science as a course, and this one seemed like it was the most focused and established one.
In school biological sciences, typically people put forward a project title, they have a chance to work with a researcher on a subject that's been fairly well defined, but on the other hand, once that student takes ownership of that project, they get a chance to really make it their own.
The student experience is about taking school leavers, diverse entrants, being able to build on their opportunities, create their capacity, and make them leave being much more employable than when they started.
And an awful lot of our graduates leave with skills that make them very employable and actually move into positions of influence within conservation bodies and within government agencies. And so ultimately they don't only become advocates for the natural world, but they also start to direct and focus management and conservation planning and legislation. And for us, obviously that's what we want, because we're all interested in a natural world.
A very good day, Assalamualaikum and Salam Sejahtera to all of you. Welcome to the International Webinar on Tropical Forest Conservation in Malaysia, organized by the Faculty of Earth Science, University Malaysia Kelantan, School of Biological Sciences, University of Aberdeen, and the Southeast Asia Rainforest Research Partnership. If you're watching from Malaysia, other Southeast Asian countries, the UK, or the rest of the world, do not forget to click on the registration link provided in the comment section to register for your e-certificate, and so that we could keep you posted on future events as well. Before that, let me take you back to the year 1990. A famous Malaysian singer, Zainal Abidin, released a song entitled Hijau, Green. He sang in Kelantanese dialect, Ale loni tua umurnya berjuta, kita usaha jauh ke dari malapetaka, which means nature is now millions of years old, and let us try to prevent it from calamity or disaster, which, well, that's basically why we are here today, gathered virtually to listen and learn about tropical forest conservation from our experts. Our first speaker works for the Sabah-Based Southeast Asia Rainforest Research Partnership, also known as SERP, which was established by the UK's Royal Society in 1985 and is headquartered in the Dunham Valley. He's well known for his extensive works for science in tropical forest conservation and restoration and the community. To introduce our webinar for today, please welcome the one and only Datuk Dr. Glenn Reynolds. So could we have Datuk Dr. Glenn Reynolds on the screen? Yep.
Hi, Dr. Furter. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure. I didn't realize I'd have to follow a song. But thank you, and it's a great honor to be introducing this seminar facilitated by University of Malaysia Kelantan. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the sort of work that we do in Sabah, largely using Sabah as in a sense, as a microcosm for the sort of issues that the whole of Malaysia is facing in terms of forest conservation, restoration, and the competing needs for food production and the support of livelihoods. So although the examples that I'll give are specific to Sabah largely, given that that's where our program is for the most part based, as I say, one can sort of regard it as a bit of a case study for what's going on, not just in Malaysia, but across Southeast Asia. And I'll also introduce a long-term friend and collaborator, Professor David Burslam from the University of Aberdeen. So I'll try and share my screen now, if I can manage that. Okay. Ferd, is that all working? Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Great.
Yes, see your screen.
Okay, super. So as Dr. Ferdoust has already said, our program was established by the UK's Royal Society, the UK and Commonwealth Academy of Science in 1985, and headquartered at the Dunham Valley Field Centre in Sabah. Dunham Valley, I think, is now pretty widely regarded as one of the leading research centres in Southeast Asia, and probably one of the top 2 or 3 centres of its kind anywhere in the tropics. Our program was largely set up through a conviction that science could make a contribution to addressing issues of forest loss, land use conversion, forest restoration, and the sustainable management of forests and plantation landscapes. And through on this side, you can see the extent of the difficulty that we're all facing across Southeast Asia, using Borneo as the example. And this slide shows the extent of forest loss from the 1950s, when the island was largely covered in mostly pristine forest at that stage, through to the situation we found ourselves in today in 2020. As I've already said, our program is based largely in Sabah. Sabah retains about 50% forest cover, and this map shows basically where those forests are placed and in what categories. So the dark green areas on this map are fully protected forests. The pale green areas are areas licensed for timber harvesting, and the other brighter coloured bits, the yellows, the blues, the reds, are also protected areas of various categories. Our program is based, at least headquartered, in the Dunham Valley Conservation Area, which is indicated on this map on with a sort of a pinkish circle. And a lot of the research that we do is carried out in partnership with the Sabah Foundation within their forest management area, indicated by the dark circle and the little thumbnail map in the corner of the frame. Dunham Valley itself comprises almost entirely pristine lowland forest, and as such it's the largest area of lowland forest, of fully protected pristine lowland forest in Sabah, and one of the largest areas of its type in Malaysia. Really, for the first 15-20 years of our program, we focused very much on the impacts of timber harvesting, so through the 80s and 90s and into the early 2000s. And that was largely in response to a conservation imperative. Logging at that time was regarded as the major threat to tropical forests, the biodiversity they support, and that was very much the focus of our program across a range of different species. We also had important parts of our component which continue today, looking at the long-term dynamics of tropical forests and how they're impacted, particularly by a changing climate, tropical forest hydrology, and how that might be impacted by timber harvesting. Forest recovery after logging has been an important part of our program and continues to be so, both natural regeneration post-harvesting, but also assisted recovery through sort of directed restoration programs. Over more recent years, the focus of our program has largely shifted, and again in response to a conservation and sustainability imperative. So most of the work that we now do focuses on issues relating to land use change, the development of agricultural plantations, and forest fragmentation. So almost all of the scientists that work as part of our program now have components of their work within plantation landscapes, mostly oil palm dominated landscapes. And as I say, that sort of focus really follows a conservation and sustainability imperative. To a large extent, the battle for primary forests in Malaysia, the conservation battle for primary forests, is now over. All of those areas of pristine forests that feasibly can be protected and conserved already have been. It's really the large expanses of degraded, logged over forest and forest that has been fragmented by agricultural development that are responsible for supporting the biodiversity, the ecosystem services that we associate with forests, are supported by these often degraded and fragmented landscapes. So it's crucial that we understand how to manage these human-modified forests and that we understand how to restore and in some cases reconnect these areas. In terms of the sort of strategic direction that we take as a program, for the first sort of 20 years of our programs in Sabah, we essentially acted as a sort of a facilitating agent. So scientists, individual scientists, research groups would come to us with their own ideas for what they wanted to do, and we would provide, with our local partners in Sabah, support. About 10 or 15 years ago, we decided that we should be taking a much more strategic approach and facilitating projects that really get at the core issues relating to forest conservation, restoration, and sustainability, long-term sustainability. And we felt the three areas that we should be focusing on are long-term forest dynamics and the impacts of a changing climate, issues relating to forest fragmentation, and perhaps more importantly, how small patches of forests embedded within plantation landscapes might contribute to sustainability. And finally, the restoration of forests that have been degraded by logging. So again, very much in close partnership with our collaborators in Sabah, we set up three major projects. The Sabah Biodiversity Experiment, which is a long-term forest restoration project. We established a large 50-hectare plot at Dunham Valley within which we measure and identify all of the trees in this plot, and the sort of driving imperative behind that is to look at the long-term dynamics of tropical forests, and particularly the influence of climate warming. And finally, in the largest experiment that we have on our books is something called the SAFE project, the Stability of Altered Forest Ecosystems project, in which we're carrying out a landscape scale manipulation. So in an area that's presently being converted to oil palm plantation, we're leaving behind a series of forest patches to look at issues related to land use change, connectivity, and so forth. So that's where we're going as a program strategically, and I should say that Professor Burslem is a key player in all of those big strategic projects that I've mentioned. So he's the perfect person to speak to you today, and on behalf of the sort of work that we're doing. In terms of the type of impacts that our science, that we hope to achieve with our science, I think it's perhaps just worth flagging one project, and again, this is a project with which David is closely involved. As some of you may know, the state government of Sabah has committed to protecting 30% of its land area under forest cover. And similar commitments are being made across the world now in terms of protected area creation. So it's fantastic to see this being done in Malaysia. Considerable progress has been made in Sabah towards this end. So you can see on this slide the increase in the extent of protected area creation over the last couple of decades. Again, the protected areas are shown in dark green, the yellowish color and blue on this map. And this is the sort of state of play as things stand right now. So about 25% of Sabah's land area is presently fully protected forest. So with a number of different colleagues, as I say, including David and his group from Aberdeen, we're taking a modelling approach to look at how the Sabah government might prioritise the creation of protected areas. So using a whole range of different parameters, above ground carbon stocks, forest formations, a whole series of biodiversity layers, connectivity and climate change layers, all of which are fed into models which prioritize conservation and protected area effort. So although this process is ongoing, and I would emphasize that we're consulting with our partners in Sabah, particularly in the Sabah Forestry Department right now, as to how these recommendations and prioritizations can be operationalized. But we're at this sort of stage right now. So on this map, the areas that we're presently recommended for protection are shown in light blue and this sort of turquoisey color, with other priority areas that potentially could be protected or are important to at least conserve under forest cover, shown in red. So this is a sort of, I guess, an example of how we are trying to bring the very best science and scientists to the table to contribute to a very practical sort of conservation imperative in Sabah. And we're very keen to work with partners to do similar work, not just in Malaysia, but potentially across the Southeast Asian region. So I hope that's given you some sort of flavor of the work that we do, and given that he's speaking to you today, the sort of contribution that David and Professor Burslem and his group at Aberdeen have been making to our program. I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand back to Dr. Firdaus, I think.
Wow, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I was actually very impressed because I've worked at the SAFE site very briefly during my PhD, and to see all that being presented with all the data, that's really impressive to actually look at real change happening. Because most of the time when we talk about conservation science and restoration, it's a bit hard to believe in it until you see like real progress is made. I would love to thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and sharing. I'm pretty sure the audience would have some questions for you, but I say, how if we accumulate all the questions, we collect the questions, and we could perhaps we could revisit all the questions right after our speakers slot. Yeah, all right. To the audience who are watching right now, if you have any questions for our first speaker, please ask them in the comment sections below, and we'll get back to it. Yeah. All right. Okay, doc. So our second speaker is actually our homegrown expert. Yeah. He will be talking on Rafflesia conservation in Malaysia, in Peninsular Malaysia. He is no other than Dr. Zul Hazman Hamzah, our senior lecturer from the Faculty of Earth Science, University Malaysia, Kelantan. Assalamualaikum. Hi, how are you, Dr. Zul? Yeah. Well, I guess you have to unmute your mic. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
All good.
Yeah,
Are you ready?
ready. So thank you, Dr. Hood, for the very brief introduction on me. Okay, today I would like to talk on conservation effort that we have done in Kelantan. And then this effort has been done for the past 10 years. So let me begin with the okay. So my topic today is on tropical rainforest conservation in Peninsular Malaysia, a case study of Rafflesia in Kelantan. So let me begin my talk on the status of forested area in Peninsular Malaysia. So as we know that Peninsular Malaysia is one of the world's richest center of plant diversity, but as compared to the Borneo, we are less diverse compared to the islands. And then talking about the plants alone in Peninsular Malaysia, there are about 12,500 species of flowering plants, including the huge species of endemic and rare. You just name it, begonia, orchids, and other species. A lot of them are still endemic and unknown to the others. And then in 60s, there are more than 75% of forest area in Peninsular Malaysia. But today, it's only left about 43.7%. A lot of area of forested area in Peninsular Malaysia has been logged, especially those who are the lowland forests, the area below than 300 meters above sea level. The last remaining forest, when we are talking about lowland area, just in the national park and other classification forests, such as in educations or recreational area. And then the drastic change from 75 to 43.7% of the forested area in Peninsular Malaysia because of lack of conservations and effective enforcement. This is the thing that I want to talk about when we bring you in the Kelantan cases. And then in the 60s to 80s, there are a lot of area, especially on lowland tropical forest, has been converted to large-scale agriculture for oil palm and rubber estate. And then the logging activity also happened in Peninsular Malaysia, especially the states such as Pahang, Kedah, and Kelantan. And then when we go to Kelantan, Kelantan is located on the northern part of Peninsular Malaysia, bordering to the Thailand, still rich with biodiversity. And then a lot of forest area is located on the southern part of this state, such as in the district of Bomusang, Machang, and Jeli. And then this is the status of forested area in Kelantan. We still have about 53.8% of forest area. It's half of the total land area in Kelantan. But when we go in detail, so the forested area in Kelantan can be divided into three, which is permanent forest estate, national park, and the state park. And then when we talk about the permanent forest reserve, it's not only fully protected because it's divided into two, which is production forest and protection forest. So for the protection forest, this forest we can classify as totally protected area. But for production forest, it's subject to the logging and converted to the forest plantation, such as for TLC, timber latex clone, acacia mango, and then eucalyptus. And then the second classification of the forest in Kelantan is national park. This is under Perhilatan or wildlife sanctuary, about 12.7%. And then the third category is state land. So this is the land which is still in forested area, but is subject to the development, convert to the agriculture and etc. So when we look at the figures for the forested area alone in Kelantan, it's only about 30.8% is totally protected area, which is 69.2% is forest, but anytime can be converted to other land uses. So means that the area in Kelantan is still in the safe hand. Okay, so this is the map of Kelantan, shows the forested area. Most of the forest area is located on the southern part of Kelantan. And then today, the thing that I want to talk is about the conservation effort that we are done in this state. So as an introduction, when I back to Kelantan, before this, I'm in Borneo for the last 9 years. And then I see that Rafflesia in Kelantan, we have 3 species of Rafflesia in Kelantan. And then nobody taking care seriously about the conservation of Rafflesia in this state. So this is, Rafflesia is the largest wildlife in the world. Everybody knows that. It's called Pakma in Bahasa or Buah Pot in Thailand. It's a unique, it's a parasitic plant, no leaf, no stem, and no root. So it's a parasite plant. And then the host plant for this species is called terrastic moss. And then Rafflesia is the international icon for conservation. Means that if you want to save if you want to taking care of Rafflesia, if you want to conserve the Rafflesia, we have to conserve the whole area. And then it also icon for the tourism. And then worldwide, there are about 39 species. And then Rafflesia is only occurred in 5 countries, which is in Thailand, Malaysia, Brunei, Philippines, and Indonesia. And then in Brunei, there are 1 species in Ulu Temboro, Rafflesia pricey. In Thailand, 1 species, Rafflesia curry. And then we have a lot of species in Indonesia, which is 15 species. And then followed by Philippines, 30 species, and Malaysia, 12 species. And then in Malaysia, we have 12 species, 7 species in Peninsula, and 5 species in Borneo. And then in Kelantan, we have 3 species of Rafflesia, which is Rafflesia sumei. We found in Jama. It's only in Jama. It's endemic in this area. And then a lot of Rafflesia curry we found along the main range of Kelantan. And then we have also the Rafflesia Kentley in Kuala Lumpur National Park and some area in Machang and Pasir Putih. And then, so this is the distribution range of Rafflesia curry in the world. And then this species is from southern part of Thailand, the range to the border of Kelantan, Pahang, and Perak. And then the one that in Lojing, to me, is the most highest population of Rafflesia curry in the world. So every time we've been there, most probably 90%, we can see the bloom of Rafflesia in this area. And then the pollinators of Rafflesia in Lojing is from our study, found that is the flies from the Diptera collaborating. And then And then when the rafflesia is bloom, means that the male and the female flower should be bloom together, because the pollen from the male will be transferred to the female. And then we identified that one of the seed dispersal for rafflesia is long-tailed giant rat. So why rafflesia need to be conserved? So this is the thing that interesting. The first one is this is the natural heritage for Kelantan and Malaysia in general. It's equal as the national icon for other species, and it is a symbol of conservation of tropical rainforest. Means that if we conserve the rafflesia, the entire area should be conserved, because rafflesia is depend on the other flora and fauna to survive. And then the most important thing is in Kelantan, because Kelantan is depend much on logging. So this is the alternative income generation for Kelantan, and it's also the job opportunity for the local through ecotourism activity, especially for the Timur ethnic people in Kelantan, in Lojeng. So let me bring you the chronology of rafflesia conservation in Kelantan. So we begin our effort to conserve the rafflesia in 2008. So we held one big expedition to this area, not only to conserve the rafflesia, not only to document the rafflesia, but also the other species. And then this expedition involved a lot of people from UMK, Malaysia Kelantan, from Kelantan Forestry Department, other university from UMS, UKM, UPM, and USM, and then also joined by the people from Department of Wildlife and National Park, and then free. So we stayed in the forest about 3 weeks to document all the flora and fauna in this area. And then during that time, we identified 20 population of rafflesia in Lojeng. And then we mapped all the rafflesia species in this area. So this is the close-up of a map, which is the most density rafflesia in Kelantan. And then I found that in the area in 2008, there are more than 100 parts available in this area. And then also in the expedition, we also survey on birds, just to show you the slide of diversity of other species in Lojeng. So these are birds in Lojeng. And then we have a small mammal which is captured in this area. And then this is the reptile which is recorded in Lojeng. Then we have the insects, moth and butterfly of Lojeng, fungi and mushroom, and then this is the lower plant in Lojeng. So the result from the expedition, we compiled the pictorial books. So this is the first pictorial books of flora and fauna that produced from in Kelantan. So this is launched in December 2008. And then after that, we document all the finding from the expedition in this book. The monograph, there are about 38 chapters in this book. And then these another books that are not yet published. Hopefully, within next year we will publish another books on Rafflesia in lodging. And then from the expedition, we decide to propose to the state government to gazette one area in lodging dedicated for Rafflesia. We call Rafflesia conservation area, but 1,000 acre or 404 hectare. And then the proposal was sent to the state government in 2010. And then in 2011, the state government declared that the area 1,000 hectare of area in lodging had been conserved for, had been gazetted as Rafflesia conservation area. And then after that, we established Rafflesia research plot in lodging, collaborate with the FRIM. And then we start doing our study on a few things, for example, growth and mortality rates of Rafflesia, the pollination, seed dispersal, host plant, ecotourism, and flower scent. And then during our study, this is one of the findings that we found that one year record for host plant of Rafflesia in Peninsular Malaysia. Before this, only one species of Terrastigma, which is related to Rafflesia, Terrastigma rafflesi. But now we have another one species of Terrastigma, which is related to Rafflesia. There is Terrastigma hockeri. And then the development in this area started in 2014. There is an MOU between the state government, UMK, and other parties. And then in 2008, we start seriously develop this area. So we plan what we want to do for this area. And then the state government want to call this area as Rafflesia Conservation Park. And then we start plan to put a lot of things in this area. So they divide into zonation for this area. This is for conservation and also for the tourism. It's a proposed development in this area. And then this is a 3D view of a glamping site that we want to develop near to the Rafflesia conservation area. And then for the Rafflesia area, we will build the boardwalk in this area to invite the tourists or visitors to tramp on the Rafflesia site. And then the issues of conservation in Kelantan, when we're talking about Rafflesia survival, is the first one is large-scale and unsustainable agriculture practice. And then, as you can see through the pictures, the large-scale area for agriculture, vegetable, is near to the Rafflesia conservation area. So our recent visit to this area, we found that there is no boundary for Rafflesia conservation area. A lot of land, forest area in state land have been converted to the agricultural area. And then the river is polluted because of the agricultural activity surrounding the Rafflesia conservation area. And then, the landslide also happened in this area because of the unsustainable practice of agriculture. And then this is what happened to the lodging now. You can see in this picture, this is the Rafflesia area. And then near to the conservation area, a lot of forests have been converted. And then you can see the river is very polluted. And then this picture I took in 2010. So the scenery is very nice. And then at the same place in 2010 when we visit this area. So this is what happened to lodging area. And then the ecotourism and local community, it also happened in this area. Every day there are 20 to 30 visitors, international visitors enter this area to see the rafflesia in wild. And then there is no sustainable practice for them to go to in this area. So we have to look at on this. We have to train the local community, especially the Temea people, how they want to conduct the tourists and also learn about the ecology of rafflesia. So there are population of Temea ethnic group live in the area. They work as in the plantation area. Then some of them working as a tourist guide to bring the tourists to see the rafflesia. So we have to give them a program. It's probably in to train them to be a guide, a proper guide, and also give the knowledge on rafflesia. And then because they are the one who become a guardian for this area, in this area. So this is the settlement of Temea ethnic group in Lodging Highlands. And then what we are concerned is the survival of rafflesia in lodging, because rafflesia is depend much on other aspects. So if we want to conserve the rafflesia, we have to conserve the entire area. So it means that the land use that happens surrounding in this area, we have also to take care. The people who are enter the area, it also we have to educate, because a lot of terrastigma and rafflesia buds is available in this area. So now there are no proper guide how we want to conduct the tourists and the practices of agriculture in this area. So with that, I conclude my talk today with rafflesia conservation area in Kelantan will be recognized locally and internationally as an international center of excellence in nature conservation, tourism, and scientific research. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Zulhazman. That's a very interesting presentation. I love all the pictures and all the graphics. From my understanding, so all these photos and pictures, they are taken by yourself, yeah? Yeah, so you have quite a photography skill.
No, some is taken by our UMK photographer.
All right, brilliant. Are you ready for the Q&A? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions actually asked by our viewers. One question is by Muhammad Adib. All right, that's our natural resources science student. He asked, does all species of Rafflesia rely on one specific host?
Yes, Rafflesia is relies on terrastigma. There are a lot of in the genus of terrastigma, there are a lot of species, which is we call in Bahasa Angulia. But in Peninsular Malaysia, there are only 2 species of terrastigma which is related to Rafflesia, which is terrastigma rafflesi and terrastigma hokkabundesi. Another terrastigma, we don't have any evidence that affected by rafflesia.
Right, thank you. We have a few more questions actually. One very interesting question, I would say, can we actually plant the Rafflesia? And so that's by Fazni Ibrahim. And there's another question by Shazmin Raisha. Is it true that Rafflesia is smelly?
Okay, can we grow Rafflesia? Per se cannot, because if we want to bring Rafflesia actually to Rafflesia, we have to bring the host plant. There are evidence in Sabah and also in Indonesia that yes, we can grow Rafflesia ex situ by bringing the affected terrastigma. That it takes 5 years in Bogor for Rafflesia to bloom on the terrastigma that we bring to the Bogor Taman Bogor. And also the same thing in Sabah. It takes 8 years for Rafflesia to bloom. Then for the second question is, what is the second question?
Is it true that Rafflesia is actually smelly? Yeah.
Yeah, it's smelly, but not very. It's not very hard because it smells to attract the pollinators. Rafflesia, the spiritual smell just to attract them, but not so smelly.
All right, thank you. All right, I guess we have a few, but I guess we only have time for one more question. Because you did present a little bit on conservation plan in Lojing. So there's a question by Nasiha binti Mokhtar. What is the future plan for Rafflesia conservation in Lojing?
So the state government of Kelantan now they realized that this area is potential to attract international tourists to this area. So now they put some money, last year about 12 million from the forestry department to develop this area. Now, if you go to the Lojing, there are a few development. They build a very nice road, and then also we have the meeting every 2-3 months to see the progress on Rafflesia in Lojing.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for your answers and your wonderful presentation. I guess that's the only time we have. Apparently, we have so many questions. So I guess if you could help to reply to the comments later, I think that would be great. Yeah. Could we have our speaker, Datuk Glenn? Hello.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Yeah. So I guess we are now ready for our final speaker of the day. So I'll invite you to introduce our speaker. Yeah.
I'm going to keep this very brief. David has been one of the leading scientists working with SERP for many years, as long as I've been associated with the program. I think even before that. So David has worked for many years, both in Sabah and Peninsula Malaysia, has led some of the most important and impactful work that we've done as part of our program. And it's a great pleasure to introduce him. David, over to you.
Hello. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Glenn. Those are very kind words. And perhaps I could start by paying tribute to Dr. Fergus and his team behind the scenes at UMK for organizing this event. It's been a great pleasure. Interacting with Fert again after saying goodbye to him, and he's actually, as you may know, he's a graduate of our school here. So hello to all of you in both in Malaysia. Good afternoon, and to those of you logging on from the UK. I know there are some. Good morning. I am going to pick up on a subject that Glenn mentioned in his opening comments, and let me just share my screen. And focus on the topic, the broad topic of forest conservation in Malaysia, which of course is a very, very large topic. And what I'd like to do is use the work that we've been doing in Sabah very much as a case study for research that has implications across the whole country and indeed across Southeast Asia. So we can use here Sabah and the works that we've been doing in Sabah as an example of the kind of research that is being done and could be expanded further in Peninsular Malaysia through the appropriate sort of collaborations. And speaking of collaboration, I first want to just point out that the work I'm going to be talking about is inherently collaborative in nature. It's very much a large-scale international collaboration. And these are the names that feature particularly in the team that did this work. It was brought together a very diverse group of scientists from across the UK, Malaysia, particularly the University of Malaysia Sabah and the Sabah Forestry Department, but also beyond, so scientists from the United States as well. So a very large team of work, and I would add that this work is very much done under the umbrella of the Southeast Asia Rainforest Research Partnership, which Glenn leads. So I want to start by just pointing out perhaps the obvious, which is that we ask an awful lot of our forests, and these are just a few key words for the ways in which we use our forests, the services we demand from them, and increasingly the recognition that forests are under pressure because of all of these demands that we make on them. So we obviously regard forests as tremendously important, especially those in Southeast Asia and specifically in Malaysia, as very important reservoirs of global biodiversity. And that's why we focus on their conservation, of course, and that's why we're meeting here today. But beyond that, of course, they are increasingly recognized as an important store for carbon, and the potential mitigating factor for further carbon emissions from fossil fuels. And then there's a whole range of other services that we recognize that forests provide to human societies. And so forest conservation is hugely important, and not just from the perspective of biodiversity, but from the much more practical perspective of this delivery of ecosystem services. And one of our tasks as conservationists, as scientists, is to try and understand how we can ensure the consistent and persistent delivery of all of these services, whilst also attempting to maintain the protection of biodiversity. And that requires us to do various things. We need to be able to measure forests, and we need to be able to measure these various attributes of forests, and we need to be able to do that across multiple scales. So we had that wonderful talk from Dr. Zul just now, where he talked about Rafflesia, incredibly important plant, and one that in places, as he emphasized, was threatened, and where protection is required. And so we need to think about the populations of organisms like Rafflesia, and we need to be able to embed our concern for conservation of those populations into landscapes which are inherently very changing, they're very dynamic, as Dr. Zul emphasized, and which are threatened by human impacts. And we need to be able to measure those aspects of the environment that are important for doing that. More broadly, we need to understand what drives variation in the diversity and the functioning of tropical forests. And we need to do that both in pristine environments, such as the ones that Glenn mentioned in his opening remarks, those like the Dunham Valley Conservation Area. But we also need to extend our understanding of the diversity and ecosystem functioning into the large areas of tropical forests in Malaysia that are now disturbed through logging, through fragmentation. And we need to understand how these human impacts affect both species diversity, the functioning of the ecosystem as well, and the ongoing capacity of the forests to deliver all those services that we value so much. So forests are highly heterogeneous, and that's very obvious when we start investigating them. We're concerned about diversity, and in my case, I'm particularly interested in trees, and so we have to be able to understand processes that influence tree populations from the very, very smallest, those that might affect the emergence, that's the germination and emergence of individual tree seedlings, and up to the largest possible scales. So how does diversity vary up and down important gradients of natural variation in gradients such as topography and elevation, and then and how is that we get a particularly good perspective on that when we look at forests from the air. I'm going to come back to this site later, but what you're observing here is at the bottom part of the photograph here. This is an aerial photograph of a site that hasn't been heavily disturbed, and yet appears to show some kind of gradient from left to right in terms of the characteristics of the forest canopy. And there's a very good reason that underlies that. So that's reflecting underlying variation in the environment that we need to be able to understand if we're to understand the drivers of diversity and function in these forests. And then finally, of course, as I've emphasized, we need to begin to be able to understand how the heterogeneous impact of human-induced disturbance, in this case it's logging clearance for small-scale industrial tree plantations embedded within natural forests, and beyond that, monocultures of other crops, in particular oil palm. How does this impact on the variation that we might be able to measure at landscape scales for these important attributes of forests like diversity and function? And by function, I mean things like productivity, the cycling of nutrients, the capacity of the forests to secure clean water and clean air. So these are the kinds of functions that we value in forests and which we might want to try and preserve into the future. So I'm going to talk about work we've been doing in Sabah for 20 years now, in my case, with collaborators, and I'm going to focus in particular on three sites, two of which Glenn introduced very well in his comments: the Dunham Valley Conservation Area, so a fully protected site, and very close to Dunham, the Stability of Altered Forest Ecosystems project, so a large-scale experimental landscape that falls under the SERP umbrella, where there's a interest in trying to understand how fragmentation of the forest landscape affects multiple ecological processes, including diversity and its maintenance. I'm also going to start out, though, with some discussion of work that we've been doing in Sepilok Forest Reserve, which is near to Sandakan in the northeast of the state, because that's the site where I really got established in my work in Sabah. As Glenn said, I have worked in Peninsular Malaysia, but a very long time ago, actually during my PhD, which I'm frightened to say is almost 30 years ago now. I was based in Singapore and spent many enjoyable weeks of my life in the forests of Johor Bahru and Pahang, exploring those environments there. But unfortunately, I haven't really been back for quite a long time. So I'm going to talk here about 20 years worth of work in Sabah. So Sepilok, this is an image from space. This is an Ikonos satellite image, and it's a broader scale image of showing the entire forest reserve, of which I showed an aerial photograph earlier on. And you can see there that immediately we might suspect that there's something interesting about the environment that's having an impact on attributes that we can observe from space. So something about the patterning of the forest there is very apparent. You can see perhaps a very fine-grained forest canopy up in the top left-hand part of the forest reserve, and some sort of stripy development of the forest canopies further to the left. And indeed, when we go into the forest and start investigating what's going on, we observe that there is a significant amount of very small-scale variation in forest habitats. And as sort of field ecologists, a primary approach to trying to understand these habitats is to do some survey work, very much sort of plot-based initially. And it becomes apparent that there's variation that's driven by underlying topography and soils. And that this variation, which is not, the site has not been heavily disturbed by humans. It's a research forest. It's been conserved in perpetuity. And so this variation that we're observing here is entirely natural. And it reflects the geology, the soil type variation, which has huge impacts that flow through the system to affect the plant and animal communities there. So our approach in the beginning was quite a traditional one. We established a series of plots, both small-scale plots on which we measured all the trees and other attributes of the community, but also a single large 160-hectare plot where we mapped just the reproductive size, the very large-sized trees in the family Dipterocarpaceae. So we were able to capture variation in communities at quite a small scale using high-resolution tree community data, but also at a larger scale using just the dipterocarps present. And we also established experiments that tried to get at the more mechanistic processes that were influencing the patterning of the trees in the community. What we found, and much of this work was done by PhD students, and many of them were Malaysians, and what we find is that the tree communities varied very significantly across a gradient of underlying soils and geology at this site. So the gradient is reflected in patterning in forest communities from, on the one hand, alluvial forests, which are on obviously the most low-lying parts of the landscape, which are where the trees are particularly tall, where the most diverse tree communities occur. So we get the biggest trees and the highest diversity in the forest communities in the alluvial forests. And then along the gradients from the alluvial forests, there were, in terms of declining soil nutrient availability and increasing elevation, we find soils on sandstone environments, sandstone ridges, and then in the most extreme environments, we find Carangas heath forests, where the concentrations of major nutrients in the soil were particularly low. So this is natural variation that's driving important variation in the community, determined mostly from plot data. And we find that this variation in the forest communities was associated with soils and water, but also important other attributes of the environment. So the cycling of nutrients through the system, rates of litter accumulation and turnover, the transfer of nutrients from the soils into the canopy. So the canopy chemistry was different across these habitats. Very important attributes of the tree community that fed through to the ecosystem level, the number of trees, the diversity of trees, And then forest environments that affect other organisms were very variable as well. So because of the taller canopies in the alluvial forests, we find that the understory environments were much darker because of the loss of the greater absorption of radiation through a taller canopy. So we did a lot of work over a large number of years to characterize these differences, and we did this very much from work on the ground. But that, of course, has its limitations, and because it's very labor intensive, and it's inevitable that with ground-based work you can only capture a very small component of the total landscape. And we were interested in trying to upscale these conclusions. To what extent do our conclusions survive, or are they translated if we measure entire landscapes? And so this is where we involved important collaborators, particularly Greg Asner from at the time the Carnegie Airborne Observatory in Stanford, but also David Coombs and Tom Swinfield from Cambridge University in the UK. Deploying a revolutionary technology, I would say, for forest ecology, which is sensors on board aircraft, which allow us to reconstruct the three-dimensional structure of forest canopies. These are laser airborne sensors called LiDAR, and also associated with that optical sensors called hyperspectral images, which allow us to reconstruct aspects of the chemistry of forest canopies. And of course, the huge benefit of deploying these sensors on board aircraft is that you can survey much larger areas than you can from the ground. And so you can ask, do our conclusions from plots scale up to entire landscapes? So we had the opportunity to do survey work across both Sepilok, which I've talked about, but also other forests across Sabah. And indeed, Greg Asner has extended his airborne survey across the whole state of Sabah. Deriving some incredibly detailed maps of the distribution of forest diversity and forest carbon at the scale of the entire state. And when we look at the data from these airborne surveys for Sabah, for Sepilok in particular, we find that we to some extent we validate and then also extend the understanding we get from plots. For example, when we process the hyperspectral data, you can get these colored images of forest canopies, and variation in the color from tree to tree is an indication of the diversity of the community that you're surveying. And you can see there, these are 3 typical pixels from the airborne survey showing the alluvial forest, the sandstone forest, and the heath forest. And you can see there a greater diversity and a larger average canopy size in the alluvial forest. And then in the heath forest at the Karangas at the other end of the spectrum, we see a much more homogeneous community of trees and a smaller average tree size. The white line that's extending vertically through those images reflect the distribution of leaf area at different heights in the canopy. So they give it, and this is derived from the laser sensor, the LiDAR on board that aircraft, and that's the mean across multiple returns. And you can get information like this that shows the the distribution of leaf area and therefore the layering of the forest canopy. And doing this for Sepilok highlighted how in the alluvial forest you can see a kind of bimodal distribution in leaf area, and an average much taller canopy than in the other 2 forest types, which seems to have a single canopy layer, and that layer is obviously occurring much lower in the canopy than in the alluvial forest. So very much expansion of the validation and expansion of the work that we were doing from the ground. As I mentioned, one of our interests is trying to determine whether from the air we can obtain larger scale estimates across the entire landscape of the diversity of tree communities. And we can do that using the hyperspectral data, the data that returns information on the relative colors of tree canopies, or the radiation, the distribution of the spectral radiation that returns to the sensor. And that can be interpreted, calibrated against our plot data to determine whether metrics of the diversity in that signal relate in any way to the richness of trees on the ground. And this figure shows our calibration, showing that we actually can get quite strong, quite good estimates of species richness of the emergent tree canopy, the bit of the canopy that the sensor is actually observing, that correlate very closely to field estimated measures of species richness, which is incredibly encouraging because it means that we can now use the entire survey data to extend our conclusions about species richness across the entire landscape. And then we can try and relate that to the abiotic environment, so the variables that we can measure in other ways about the environment. And what we've done here is plot how species richness derived from these airborne sensors and calibrated against field data, how that varies in this case with elevation across Sepilok. And because we can do this at the scale of the entire aerial survey, we have thousands of data points rather than just the small number that we could do if we had ground-based data. And you can see here quite a strong signal of declining species richness as we go up in elevation from 50 to 200 meters. And it may not surprise you to discover that species richness of trees declines with elevation. That's a well-known pattern as you go up mountains, of course. But these are not mountains. These are just small, really quite low elevation hills. And we were very surprised to see that there is such a strong signal, even at that very small scale of variation in the topography. And it does suggest that tree communities are responding in a very high resolution way to changes in the environment. And we could only get at this signal because we had the capacity to extend our analysis across the entire landscape. What's really interesting is that we also get quite strong data on some functional traits from the aerial survey data. In this case, wood density. So the calibration of the wood density signal from hyperspectral data against field estimated wood density data from plots is really, again, quite strong. And that's very encouraging because it means that we can scale wood density to the entire landscape in exactly the same way. And wood density is very, very important from our interest in understanding how forests store carbon, because wood density is an important contributor to variation in the amount of carbon that forests store obviously in wood. And here again, we find a relationship to elevation. So wood density, mean wood density per pixel in this case, increases as you go up in elevation from about 50 up to 200 meters. Again, a very small amount of variation in elevation giving rise to significant increases in wood density. And then we can take all this information and map a range of different variables using the airborne surveys across entire landscapes. And this is the swath of forest that was surveyed from the aircraft for Sepilok, with a range of different kinds of variables all mapped. And taking this kind of information is incredibly valuable because it allows us then to ask questions using models to determine how metrics like carbon density, above ground carbon density, or carbon storage in forests are driven by this range of different variables. And this is the typical kind of analysis that we could do. We were interested in this metric above ground carbon density, and that's displayed here in the bottom. This is a structural equation model, and the arrows display the pattern of causation, of inferred causation. Negative drivers are indicated in red, positive drivers are indicated here in blue. And we were interested in what drives fine scale variation in carbon storage. And this is important because it's an important contributor to understanding how forests can mitigate carbon emissions. If we can extend this kind of analysis across much larger spatial extents up to the scale of the whole state or even the whole country, then we can develop a much more predictive understanding of how we might increase carbon storage, for instance, as we're required to do under the Paris Climate Agreement regulation. Here we find in Sepilok that the single most important driver of above ground carbon density is in fact forest structure. So parts of the forest which have large amounts of gaps, as you might expect, those gaps take away don't contribute very much carbon, and therefore there's a strong negative driver of the amount of gaps, the gap fraction, to carbon storage at the landscape scale. Wood density has a much smaller signal, but it contributes in a number of different ways. You can see the pathways through this diagram can get quite complex. The environmental topographic features at the top, slope, elevation, TPI, which is a measure of the structure of the landscape, contribute rather indirectly through attributes of the tree community. TCH is top canopy height. So taller trees, taller canopies contribute positively to and directly to carbon storage, but they also contribute negatively via the relationship to gap fraction. So all of this information is you can get from doing these large scale aerial surveys, and this is, I think, probably this approach is set to revolutionize the way in which we measure forests. So I want to turn now to a single piece of program of work that was done by a large consortium, and here we're extending beyond our focus entirely on undisturbed systems and moving into a logged forest system. And this is the biodiversity and land use impacts on tropical ecosystem function, the BARLI project that concluded a couple of years ago, and brought together a very large team of scientists under the SERP umbrella to work in the safe landscape with some outlying plots in undisturbed forests as well. And of course, Dr. Furness will know this project extremely well because he was one of the contributors to it as part of his PhD. So here in particular, we have to recognize the important contribution of Professor Yitan Tay, who was then at the University of Aberdeen. He subsequently moved, but so he was the leader of this project and brought us all together for this work. So as Glenn mentioned in his comments, the safe landscape is an ideal opportunity for this kind of work because we have the benefits of a series of fragments established of different size within a matrix of landscape which is gradually being converted into oil palm. And so we can make use of plots that exist in these fragments, and we have a lot of baseline information from other studies that have been done under the SAFE umbrella. It's in the south central part of Sabah, as you can see in the map there, and it involves plots across a gradient of former logging. So there are control sites in old growth forest, but then there are parts of this landscape which have been moderately logged or very heavily logged, and then there's oil palm as well. And as Glenn mentioned, there's also large scale rehabilitation of some of the forest. So just here's an overview of the wider objectives of the whole program. So we were interested in particular on how land use change affected by geochemical cycling. So that is the cycling of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and in particular carbon, how that was affected by land use change, so particularly logging and conversion to oil palm. And how does this land use change in particular affect the functional diversity? So the ways in which the forest functions, how does it accumulate carbon, how does it turn over nutrients in the system, and how does it deliver these important services that I mentioned? I want to focus here in particular on the effects of logging on functional diversity. It's a much broader program of work, and it's generated a lot of publications, which if you're interested, I can refer you to. But I'm just going to pick off a little bit of it here. So the work I was most involved in, which was the relationship between logging and tree diversity, both at the species level, but also integrating the traits of different species to understand this integrated measure of functional diversity. Now, the logic underlying this is that when you log a forest, of course, you're removing in a quite selective way certain species with certain kinds of traits. Obviously, there is damage to surrounding trees as well, but the target of logging is this particular taxonomic group of trees, the Dipterocarpaceae, and the Dipterocarps, of course, may have specific traits which, when you remove the big Dipterocarps, results in a big change in the way that the system functions. So we got at this by measuring traits of the trees. So that's things like their chemical composition, their structural traits, so things like their size and the thickness of leaves that dominated in the tree canopies, their physiological traits, so things like their photosynthetic rates and their respiration rates. And then we wanted to integrate all of that information to try and understand how that would feed through to affecting other important processes like herbivory, the amount of material that secondary consumers would eat, the amount of the material that's available for decomposition and how rapidly that decomposition occurred, how that fed through to changes in microbial activity in soils, and so on. Quite a wide variety of different processes. And ultimately, we were interested in trying to understand how logging would affect the capacity of the trees to store carbon and to take up important nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, and therefore whether there would be much longer term implications of logging for these ecosystem processes. Our approach initially, we wanted to integrate both field-based measurements, but also, as I emphasized earlier in this talk, airborne-derived data as well. So our field data were collected on 8 1-hectare plots. We did a very detailed sampling of about 500 trees, and we did this in old-growth forest plots, but also plots that had been selectively logged. As you'll be aware, of course, the old-growth forests are dominated by trees in this family, Dipterocarpaceae. So most of the trees that we sampled at the canopy level in old-growth forests were Dipterocarps. It turns out there were an awful lot of Dipterocarps still left in the logged forests, but they tended to be on average smaller. And we therefore sampled a wider range of trees as well, both the large and the small trees in both of these kinds of forests. Okay, so old growth forest and selectively logged forests vary in a lot of different ways. So biomass and tree canopy height, the number of gaps and density and so on. So we had to characterize those basic sort of structural components of the two forest types. And then we had to do a very detailed field sampling over about 8 months, where we measured these traits, or collected the material where the traits could subsequently be measured in the lab. And I won't go through this in detail, but if you look at the list of functional traits there, they include components that reflect leaf chemistry and leaf structure and the maintenance of leaves, but also wood traits. So things like branch wood density and wood anatomy. So we did much of this work in Sabah itself. We exported a small amount of material as well for doing some of the work that we couldn't do in Sabah, but most of the work was done in Sabah, and much of it by Sabahan scientists, actually. Here's an overview of the trees that we sampled on the plot. So you'll see it's quite targeted sampling on these 8 1-hectare plots, 4 of them in old growth forests and 4 of them in selectively logged forests. So I guess one of the things you get from this slide is that although we sampled trees representing certainly more than 80% of the basal area in terms of the species on the plot, there were an awful lot of trees on these plots that were not sampled. Even though we were doing this work for 8 months in the field continuously, there were an awful lot of, it's very, very detailed, intensive work. So we did all these measurements and then did some data analysis. And this here, I'm displaying here what's called a principal components analysis. So what we wanted to do is look to see if we were to integrate variation across these 8 plots in all of these more than 30 traits that we measured, would we capture signals that reflected the gradients that we were that we knew existed from land use history? And the answer to that question very simply is yes. There's a very strong signal of logging that feeds through to the typical traits of the canopy trees in this environment. So we find, for instance, so that the first axis, the axis that explains most variation in our traits, is essentially a logging disturbance gradient. So we find that the logged forest plots fall on one side of this ordination diagram, and the old growth forests, the unlogged plots, fall on the other. And then we can start picking out the traits that typify the extremes of that gradient from unlogged to logged forest. And that gives us important information about the ways in which logging affects the expression of traits in tree communities, and that's then might enable us to predict how when you extend that understanding across landscapes, how tree communities will change, and how that might feed through to changes in important processes like cycling of nutrients and carbon storage. We uncovered a second really important axis that was a bit of a surprise, but in retrospect we shouldn't have been surprised. But actually it turns out that the second most important factor that drives variation in tree traits is soils. And that's important because, of course, soils will vary independently of the ways in which land use affects soils. Land use affects tree communities, and so we're left with a capacity to, in principle, predict from a combination of land use history and soil variation how forests will express their traits at landscape scales. What was really interesting, though, is when we integrated all that information and looked at scaling the diversity of trait expression across plots, we find that on average there was no difference in functional diversity. So the ways in which traits were expressed on average at landscape scales wasn't different between old growth forest and logged forest. But what was different was the variation in functional diversity. So we find that logged forest environments are much more variable in their expression of traits than old growth forests are. So that's partly, of course, a function of the way, the heterogeneous, the very variable ways in which logging affects forests. And so we see that expressed in the way that the traits will accumulate at the community scale, much greater variation in logged forests. So returning then just briefly to soil nutrients, and soil nutrients are very important. We saw there that they explain an important component of the variation in the expression of traits at the community scale. And some nutrients are much more important than others. And in the environments we're considering here, so tropical forests in Southeast Asia, we envisage that phosphorus is particularly important. And we might anticipate that if we take out a particular class of trees, in this case the dipterocarps, or a family of trees, which are the trees that are harvested during logging, which have a very effective microbial symbiosis with fungi in their root systems that allows them to mineralize organic sources of phosphorus from soils, and particularly from organic matter, so leaf litter, for instance. The ectomycorrhizal dipterocarp trees, if you take those out, especially the really big ones from the forests, might that have an impact on the overall accumulation of phosphorus at the ecosystem scale? And might you even see a signal for that in terms of the amount of phosphorus that is stored in tree canopies across large logged forest environments? And here we're returning to our airborne survey work, and again working through with collaborators here in Cambridge University, who had data on the hyperspectral data I mentioned, which has quite a strong predictive signal for phosphorus in the tree leaf, in the tree canopies, here calibrated against field measurements of phosphorus. This allowed us to ask the question: can we scale the measurements of canopy phosphorus and indeed nitrogen across these logged forests, and ask whether logging the forest results in a consistent signal for nitrogen and phosphorus stored in tree canopies, because of the export of phosphorus in the timber that was extracted, and perhaps through soil erosion as a consequence of logging as well. Has there been a net decline in the amount of phosphorus that these forests can store? So this is an example of the kind of data that you can get, again, from hyperspectral imagery, projecting from the airborne data. Here, the data we used to calculate this measure of nitrogen and phosphorus expressed as a ratio in tree canopies. And the color scheme is such that the more yellow, the hotter colors are sites that have higher nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, so more nitrogen to phosphorus in the tree canopies. And the sort of darker blues are the areas that are that have lower values of nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. So lower values of nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, of course, reflect lower values of nitrogen and relatively higher values of phosphorus. And then just to use this data, this kind of data was then projected across both old growth and selectively logged tree canopies, across, again, also an elevation gradient, to ask whether there is a consistent difference in the amount of nitrogen and the amount of phosphorus according to whether the trees were logged or not, or that the canopies were derived, or the data were derived from forest canopies where logging had occurred or not. There is a very clear and consistent signal in the data that the concentrations of both of these nutrients were significantly lower in forests that had been logged. And that's potentially worrying because it suggests that, you know, this logging took place some decades before the sampling took place. And it does suggest that perhaps there has been a long-term loss in the underlying nutrient capital from these forests as a consequence of logging. That signal diminishes a bit as you go up in elevation in the environment, and that's possibly because the extent or the scale of logging or the intensity of logging was somewhat lower at higher elevations. And we also, of course, naturally see some declines in soil nutrients and therefore canopy tree nutrients as you go up in elevation. So there's a nuance there around canopy height, but the consistent message is a reduction in the capital, the underlying nutrient capital in the tree community as in response to logging. And this again would have been totally invisible to us from just measurements on plots, because we would not have been able to do enough sampling. It would have been just too logistically difficult to do that sampling across the entire landscape and to do it at scale, and would have been just too expensive. So again, this is another kind of illustration of the benefits of doing aerial-based survey work in forests. Okay, now I just want to sum up the main conclusions from the work that we've been doing, particularly in the last few years. But in the case of Sepilok, this is a kind of 20-year summary of some of the plot-based work we've done. It's very clear that in even undisturbed environments, there are small-scale gradients that we need to be very aware of, and how they influence tree composition, species richness, and the expression of particularly significant traits. So those are gradients in elevation and soils. And this is important from conservation perspective, because of course we do want to be able to ensure that we've protected important aspects of the entire species community, the entire composition of communities across these gradients, in order to make sure that we capture all aspects of the diversity of communities. We therefore understand that these kinds of variables are important to us in order to maintain high tree species richness across landscapes. We observe very significant impacts of logging on species composition. I think we knew about that from other studies over long periods of time. What we've been able to do using the airborne data sets is to expand that across landscape scales and look at how trait expression is expressed, how traits are expressed in response to logging at very large scales, and how this might be independent of these other gradients that we believe to be important, things like elevation and soils. When you take all that trait data together, you find community level functional diversity is really similar between logged and old growth forests, looking at mean values, which suggests on the one hand that log forests are really very important. We must retain them. We must not convert them, because they do contain really significant reservoirs of diversity. But that they are different to unlogged forests because they express that diversity in a much more variable way. And most importantly, in terms of our methods, is that the remote sensing has given us a huge advantage in terms of upscaling the measurements we made from the field. But in principle, we need both. We need to be able to calibrate our remote sensing measures, and therefore we do need field measurements, but we need to look towards remote sensing to the future in order to capture these and detect these patterns. Okay, so I'll stop there. I want to just again pay tribute again to the large team of people which have contributed to this work, both in Malaysia, in the UK and beyond, and to thank you for listening. I'm very happy to take questions from the audience. I'll stop sharing my presentation now and return to the live stream.
Right. Thank you very much, David. That was a very in-depth presentation. All right. We have quite a list of questions actually from the audience, but I'm a little bit afraid that we might not have the time. We can take perhaps only one question. Yeah. All right. So we have a question from Dr. Mary Ann Leong. So she asks, "Hi David, if I understand correctly, your decades of work builds the foundation on the relationship between species richness and topography, elevation, surrounding environment, etc. Do you, or perhaps your collaborators, also extend the research to include the impacts of climate change in the work?"
That's a that's a very interesting question, and I would say we are developing the important infrastructure that we need for that, and part of that infrastructure exists already because Malaysia has a national forest inventory, and obviously for looking at climate change impacts you need a time series of data, and the National Forest Inventory, which Malaysia does every 5 years, I think it is, will provide that baseline and importantly secure the understanding of how forests change through time. So, as Glenn mentioned in his opening remarks, the 50-hectare plot that we have in Dunham Valley has now got 2 censuses done, so we can look at change at over a relatively short period of time. But what we need to do is ensure that all of the census data, all these censuses, are maintained over much longer periods of time. One of the longest running studies is the work that's being done by FRIM and collaborators at the Smithsonian Institution based in Paso Forest Reserve in Negri Sembilan. So they have a plot there that was established in 1985 and has been recensused every 5 years. Again, it's a 50-hectare plot, so incredibly detailed forest community level data. So I would think that in the short term, data coming from Paso will give the highest resolution within Malaysia for understanding climate change impacts on tree communities. But I would just urge anyone listening who's involved in forest censuses that we need to ensure that these are maintained, with regular recensus work every few years to ensure that we capture these climate change impacts. I mean, studies from other parts of the world suggest that forests are almost certainly changing in response to climate change. Lots of work we're showing increases in forest because of elevated CO2 concentrations. That's one of the clear signals that's coming from what's being done in the Amazon and to some extent in Africa as well. So yes, we need to maintain these studies and get involved in the international collaborations that allows it to the studies to contribute at a kind of international scale.
Right. Thank you very much, David. The questions, capturing my voice back, but I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for today. Yeah. Well, I believe all the questions been asked. I would send them to you, and also Dato' Glenn and also Dr. Zohazman, and then perhaps you guys could reply to the questions, and I'll help.
Sure, absolutely. Hi, Benny.
Yeah, because we have quite very active listeners, and yeah. All right. So I suppose before we end our live sessions today, I would like to thank all our panels for making your time and being here. We hope that this is not going to be the first and the last. Hopefully we could do this again, hopefully in 2021. Yep. Right. And with that, thank you very much, everyone.
Okay.
Hope to see you guys again. Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
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 Bye.
Faculty of Earth Science have been established in 2012. We are in one of the youngest university in Malaysia. We have a vision to become a pioneer in sustainability, environment, and natural resource through entrepreneurship agenda.
Currently, Faculty of Earth Science offering 3 undergraduate programs. We also have 2 preparatory programs which managed at Faculty of Earth Science.
For Bachelor of Applied Science, Natural Resource with Honours, the focus of this program are much more on our biosphere, which means we are focusing on our plants, our animal, and also the management of our tropical forest. For another program, which is Bachelor of Applied Science, Sustainable Science with Honours, the program itself relate more on environmental element, which is we would like to sustain our environment together with the importance of economy and also social.
Always apply teaching and learning section by using technology such as by using GIS, drone, geospatial mapping technology, and also modeling. Students also be taught with to integrate geoscience understanding from classroom or practical learning with geoscience data from a variety of sources, creatively using the latest digital technology.
Science Preparatory department is a new department and need to taking care and manage of 2 academic programs. Both of these programs will need to learn biology, mathematics, chemistry, and also physics.
Faculty of Earth Science Museum, actually we have various dry and wet specimens such as insects, small mammals, reptiles. Besides that, we also have rocks, minerals, and also fossils. So actually all those specimens being collected by our students.
To stay relevant, you have to be flexible. Besides flexible, we have to be unique. In Faculty of Earth Science, we have multidisciplinary research. Recently, we are focusing on the research on minerals and the fossil. Other than that, we use remote sensing and GIS in monitoring forests and urban planning. This research has been successfully done within our capacity of staff, supported with a grant that we received from government and other agencies.
We are optimistic to become one of the best faculty that focus on in environmental in Malaysia.
We offer excellent opportunities for the students to gain really in-depth knowledge about a particular area of biological sciences. We have a very broad school in terms of the facilities and the staff expertise available to the students.
So we're a school of biological sciences and also environmental sciences. So we cover a real wide range of disciplines within the school. And that translates into a number of different courses for students that are on top programs. So they benefit from the breadth of disciplinary expertise that we have in staff.
So our lab has developed over the last 5-6 years into one of the top research labs in the world for honeybees. We have techniques here that no one else can do. We're at the real cutting edge of genetics, genomics, proteomics. We've got hives in the field that we can use for research. And we have internationally renowned researchers visiting our lab regularly to pick up techniques and to collaborate with us.
I think the University of Aberdeen provide a very large range of facilities, and that contributes to their success and also to their learning journey in terms of scientific experience.
We were ranked first in the United Kingdom in the recent Research Excellence Framework. We were ranked first under Agriculture, Veterinary and Food Science, including Soil and Environmental Sciences. And so we have world-class research facilities and, more importantly, research staff.
The bee research here is quite established. There's quite a few PhD students working on bees, and our supervisors have been doing it for a few years now. They're really good research reputation that Aberdeen and the department's got.
We are a school that really believes in practical skills and technical skills, so we do a lot of practical teaching. So all of our courses involve some practical work that might be in the lab or it might be in the field.
We've got 9 residential field courses, mostly about a week long. They're mostly in Scotland, but we also have 2 in the Mediterranean, 1 in Greece, which is a marine-based field course, and 1 in Spain, which is an ecosystems-based field course.
On the plant ecology course, which I teach, we go out for 3 full days, 2 days into national nature reserves, 1 on the coast and 1 inland beside the Cairngorm National Park.
We've got resident populations of seals, we've got resident populations of dolphins that we can study. But also when you go the other way, we're very close to the Cairngorms and all the beautiful and wonderful forest habitats and mountain habitats we've got there.
In a day's field trip from Aberdeen, we've seen a wild variety of animals, including otters, a range of birds that have migrated here. We've seen eagles, and it's all within a single day. So imagine living here and having that opportunity on your doorstep every day.
So Scotland is actually a wonderful environment in its own sake. So actually coming to Aberdeen is one of these hidden jewels of the UK.
It's very convenient for you as a student to have everything close by, and it makes your life much easier.
So we try and give the students that experience of constructing a piece of work that demonstrates their achievement in the course, but that is relevant to what they would be asked to do in the workplace.
It was the best place to do it. So I didn't see a lot of other places that took soil science as a course, and this one seemed like it was the most focused and established one.
In school biological sciences, typically people put forward a project title, they have a chance to work with a researcher on a subject that's been fairly well defined, but on the other hand, once that student takes ownership of that project, they get a chance to really make it their own.
The student experience is about taking school leavers, diverse entrants, being able to build on their opportunities, create their capacity, and make them leave being much more employable than when they started.
And an awful lot of our graduates leave with skills that make them very employable and actually move into positions of influence within conservation bodies and within government agencies. And so ultimately they don't only become advocates for the natural world, but they also start to direct and focus management and conservation planning and legislation. And for us, obviously that's what we want, because we're all interested in a natural world.